So Hannah, we were saying sort of virtually backstage, it feels like I know you because we've chatted so many times on LinkedIn, but we've never actually met. So thank you for taking time to be here today.
Thank you for having me. And I know I feel the same way. It's kind of like we've been chatting over email and LinkedIn for a couple of years now, which is a bit
Well,
insane.
yeah, for sure. And one of the things that I noticed on LinkedIn that you did recently is you mentioned the idea of an outcome engineer because you kind of mentioned you had a bit of an existential crisis with the title business analyst. And I know I'm just throwing this on you now without any warning, but I'm curious as to what drove that decision.
Um, that's a topic. The kind of work I was doing in that kind of lead principal BA, almost like principal advisor space, of kind of like the real wrangling at the front end of projects or across something complex, is at least in New Zealand, in my observation, becoming no longer part of the BA role. The BA role is becoming something much more kind of defined and in the details. And so if I wanted to continue doing what I liked, I kind of needed to find a way to hack that. This is my hack that. It's not like a long-term solution, but it's a way for me to pick up the work that's complex and gnarly without being put in a box and being able to interact with people without people being like, okay, cool, you're here for the requirements, yes? And I'll be like, no, I am not here just for the requirements.
Yeah.
That's my answer in a box, if that's
Yeah, no,
suitable.
and I know that's one thing that we both share is like actually the complex, the gnarly, the knotty, the messy stuff. That's what I find the really interesting stuff to start work on and to shape and to scope. So getting onto to today's topic. So like it certainly seems to me that organizations are increasingly moving to a product-centric model, whatever that means. And I say that because, in my experience, at least here in the UK, that seems to mean quite different things to different people and different organizations. So, how would you define a product-centric model?
Well, I think you hinted to it earlier, whereas there is there's lots of people who say that this is the definition for a product centric model. And there are people in the community who will claim that they can define it, but there's just so much variety. But typically, what they mean is, in my experience, if you're talking about product, you're talking about you have some or a set of people who are accountable not for delivery of a set of scope, but for a product. And when I say product, I mean a system and or collection of systems that is delivering some defined value, and your job is to make that more valuable over a set of time. And so it becomes less about achieving this scope and more about making this better. um, and then everything is a variance of that, but you then have things that are typical of that environment, which is usually a funded team. And so that money becomes less about tied to objective, like do this for this money, like I'm buying a house, and more like, cool, we're going to fund you and we really want you to increase turnover, increase revenue, increase conversion, do things that make things better, as opposed to buying that as like I'm going to spend 2 mil on a 20% increase in conversion. That is what I kind of think of it in the world. Does that align to your view?
It does, it does. And as you were speaking there, Hannah, I was thinking that is perhaps why things like OKRs fit quite neatly in a product world. I mean, I'm not, they can fit in, they can fit well in lots of contexts, but from what you've just described there, I was thinking, yeah, because the OKRs kind of fit above that level and they will then help drive some of the changes on the product, but it's almost like change as usual rather than defined projects of change. Um,
Yes.
I think I agree. I think one of the things I have seen though, and I'd be keen to get your view on, is where it's the product is almost like an internal application. So you get someone who is a product manager or product owner for, say, I don't know, a legacy mainframe system or a
Mhm.
CRM system. And I'm always really uncomfortable with that because I'm like, really, a better way
Interesting.
of doing it is to think about the value stream you're offering to whoever your customers are, plural, and to cut it up that way. What's your view on that?
Oh, that's so interesting. I think there's no clean answer, right? Like if you take like a team topologies, oh my God, I've never had to say that out loud before.
It's hard to
But
say that.
there's at a certain point in scale, you can't do that clean. Everything's just oriented around the customer. You're dealing with too much complexity. And so there's a
Yeah.
point where abstracting it away. I actually quite like product teams internally, mostly because so one of the cool things about product is that what you're trying to do is genuinely instantiate total cost of ownership. Projects are narrow in scope. They have a timeline and then they run out, and they so often, like almost always, underestimate the total cost of ownership, the ongoing maintenance, the small edits. And so product is trying to be like upfront, you want to do this? You're going to have this team pretty much forever running on this thing. Now that aligns really nicely for like platform stuff, like whether it be like a CRM or data system or ERP or whatever the big system is. It's kind of nice because you're actually just saying, this team is dedicated to this platform and to make it as good as it possibly can within the constraints that you're existing in the environment. And so in some respects, it's almost like I see enterprise doing better product work behind the scenes than they do in the front end, because it's kind of like, it's simpler. It's like this product needs to work best as it can, if that makes sense. But I understand, like I totally understand your reservations about not doing the value. Like if you can do the value to the customer, like the end to end, oh, you should definitely do that. But that's so hard, right? To do right? Like very hard, very
Yeah,
complicated.
and actually, as you've described it there, I think what I liked about that description is if it can't be the whole end to end, it can still be a partial enabler for some value being derived by a customer. So I think where I've seen it, I've been concerned. I've been not necessarily concerned, but I've had reservations. It's been so micro decomposed that almost the customer and the outward value's been lost.
Yes.
Whereas actually when you said platform, like it was like a light bulb went on. I'm like, oh right, so it could be almost like a channel, one channel or part of a channel, and
Yep.
and still there is an outcome there which ties up with a bigger outcome which makes sense in the context of a service or whatever.
Just to be really clear though, you're right. Like I have seen teams built around like an integration layer. That that was not good. It didn't
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sense.
yeah, 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 yeah. Interesting. So my first question was the classic, what is product? And the answer is lots of things to lots of people, but we've got a really, really good working definition to work from. So my second question is why? Why do you think product-based approaches have emerged?
um, just complexity, right? Like the main problem, I mean, no one like this whole dichotomy of like there was waterfall and then there was agile, and like a product came from that kind of context of like your like outcome oriented like teams building stuff on a product. That whole binary is just like sort of incorrect. No one thought that waterfall was like a great mechanism. They were like, this is bad, but it's the best we've got. And like we didn't have the ability to iterate because software build was harder and slower and more complicated. So I think where we've ended up is just a response to the environment of the complexity that we're dealing with. It's no longer, you just simply cannot, with the kind of scale that we're working with, to go, okay, cool, here's a set of money. I want a CRM that's doing all of the things that I want to redo these processes. Like that is impossible. The amount of money you'd have to spend upfront to do discovery and lock things down, you will have taken like 2 years, in which case the tech has changed, all of the products have changed, and your entire environment has changed. So I feel like the big enterprise side has latched onto product as a way to kind of control and to like anchor the complexity in a way that you can talk about, and you can talk about to execs, because I feel like that's the part. Execs are used to buying product projects, right? They're like, build me a house, take my money. But then in a product sense, when actually they're just like sitting on top of like millions of dollars worth of infrastructure, millions of dollars worth of products, actually it becomes harder for them to conceptualize what they're buying and how. And so product becomes, okay, cool. Now we're using an enterprise to talk about what these are and how we talk about the value of them. I think that's how it's been adopted. But ultimately, product, just complexity to deal with the fact that we can no longer say, you give me X dollars, I will deliver you this outcome, because we can't say that anymore. Just too shifty. Would you agree with that? Is how?
Yeah, I think so, and I think well, I mean, I agree, and I think there's multiple reasons, right, as in any context, why organisations become interested. But sort of thinking back to something you said in opening about total cost of ownership, it's really interesting because one of the things I am always so that there are if and I know there are a few people actually here in on the webinar watching who have worked with me over the years, and that they will know there are certain things I bang on about a lot. And one of the things is not necessarily framed as TCO, but run cost. It's like, yeah, well,
Yeah.
we're talking about the implementation cost here, but what about the run cost? Because actually that's really important. And so I think, having more conversations around those sorts of things in an operationalized sense is really, really important. Um, the other side of why I think people are interested in product, the reasons that you said are absolutely fantastic, legitimate reasons. I think there's also an element of it's just kind of trendy at the moment, and and
Yes.
and so I do see some, like when you see, like about 10, 15 years ago, agile or even longer ago, there was that kind of bubble, and so I kind of have a bit of a fear that there's going to be much as there is and was agile in name only, there's going to be product in name only,
Oh,
where it's kind of like,
no, no, that I 100% A, already happening, and B, I was talking to like like you have people, I don't know, you've got people in your network who like you kind of look up to and you're like, I want to be you one day. I was talking to one of them in my network, and her strong reckons, she's like, no, product's on the way out. Like in about 10 years, we'll be like having the same death of product roles that we're seeing in Agile now. And she's like, maybe even quicker, maybe 5. And so I think absolutely the product in name only is totally a thing, like very.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting, interesting. Well, let's go to some questions that people have submitted. So, Mark asks, do you find people get too hung up on names and job roles? I know we were talking about outcome engineering to begin with, but equally there's like, well, are you a business analyst, or you or me a business analyst? Are we a product, whatever? What's your view on like job titles, job roles?
I mean, it's irony. Like, I want to say, like, yes, people get totally hung up on it, but also I got hung up on it. So, like, I think that we all collectively suffer, including myself, on boxes are nice. And so we like having a box because it means that we can be like feel comfortable. So yes.
Yeah, it's I desperately want to disagree with you. Like I really want to disagree with you and say that, but like I so okay, so for me there's two parts. This one is my job title is deliberately principal consultant, even though I consider myself a business analyst, because then the boundaries just aren't there in the same way.
Yep.
So like but that's just that's a tactical thing. However, I really enjoy the fact that there's a community of people who I can met. Like we I would say we met through the BA community, the global BA community, and so I think that people do get hung up on them, but there is some usefulness to that in that actually there is there's a distributed community knowledge out there. But what I think is really interesting is how do we blur the edges of that with other communities to find out what they know and for us to do,
Yep.
to permeate what we do into their world. Um, so
Or permeate what they're doing into our world, like which is
yeah,
I think what I do much more in the UX space is the closest place where I blur out into like service design, UX design. And I feel like there's lots of things that they have learned over the last decade or so
I,
that we can take on.
Completely agree. UX, I think also like, well, I know we were talking about systems thinking, but like before we start, there are so many areas that where there's that the like glass walls I've heard them described as, like that they're
Mm.
not really there. We can get through them if we want to. Um, so so our next question is from an anonymous attendee, and of course you can ask a question anonymously if you would prefer. Just tick the anonymous button. But this anonymous attendee asks, have you experienced a product being used wrongly? Our place splits bug fixes as a product, and we ended up making contradicting fixes on the same area. Gosh.
Oh my God, bug fixes is a product. So short answer, yes, I have experienced product used wrongly. I think everyone who has seen product in practice has seen bad product also in practice. Like this isn't, I think I've come close a couple of times in a particular team when there was like like closest to the kind of Silicon Valley group kind of concept of like a true product team. But I don't think I've even worked in a true, like what they describe, like the Marty Kagan, the kind of like the product peeps from the US. I don't think I've ever worked in an environment that was like pure. So like it's just a continuum of wrong, and
Yeah.
how wrong it is.
Well, now there's an interesting thought, isn't there? A continuum of wrong, right? And no, no, but stick with me on this. Stick with me because if it's a continuum of wrong, it's also the opposite of that is it's a continuum of rights. So actually, maybe there are several sliders, right? So if you're in a Silicon Valley startup, you can put those sliders in a certain place, and it makes sense.
Yep.
If you are a bank that implemented its first information processing system is in 1960, and there's still a version of it working on COBOL, then you're
Mhm.
going to have to put those sliders in a different position. But it doesn't mean that you can't take the bits of it that make sense for the context.
Agreed. Like I feel like there's lots of stuff that we can learn from product. And in fact, I would say what I often end up doing is we'll first start working out whether it's product or not, because people will be like, cool, we're running product. And you're like, okay, are you though? Like, what are you actually doing? Because you might have a product owner, you might have a product manager, you might have a whole bunch of stuff, but you're actually just doing projects. And that's cool. That's totally, totally cool. But we should, what's said on the box versus what's actually happening, very different things. Um, and then like, and second, if you're doing product, I'm often operating in enterprise settings. And so what I'm actually doing is bringing things from project into that product setting to give the kind of level of governance around the kind of, if there is expectations around what's coming up or the milestones, then I'm bringing that kind of rigor in. Or I'm doing the opposite, which is I'm in a project and I'm like, cool, that we'd get a better outcome if we bring some of this like really good thinking of like our customer centric thinking and approaches and like product views so that we're setting up the organization for when we all go away because we're not going to be here when it's in BAU context. Um, and so I think it's not only is it a continuum, but there's stuff that can be learnt from both and leveraged in both contexts, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, the questions are coming in thick and fast, but I'm gonna segue from the questions being. Do keep the questions coming in if you're on live, but I want to just take the conversation in a slightly different direction first, which is because you mentioned things being on the periphery, and you mentioned UX and service design, and my
Mm-hmm.
ears kind of pricked up at that because some would argue that products only exist in the context of a service. So, like, does it naturally overlap with service design? And is the distinction important, or is it like an academic distinction in your view between like product stuff and service design?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, and like I feel like whether or not you're doing service design, as in um, Adrian, you and I, we're going to do service blueprints and we're going to like unpack stuff and we're going to like identify and like go through the process. That's one thing. Often products or even projects are delivering a service, whether or not they instantiate that the service design practice. Those are two different things. So I'm not sure it's as easy to say, oh, like you are doing service design, even if you don't have a service designer and you don't have a thing, you might just be doing it kind of like not that well.
Yeah.
And so yes, I think that if you brought in a service designer who thought in terms of services, they would say, oh yeah, you're delivering a service, because that's how they think of the world. But I don't think the things are synonymous. I don't think you have to have a service designer on deck or have a concept of service design to be doing service design. But does that make sense? Like, I don't think that. Would
It
you agree?
does. Well, it's a question I asked because I genuinely am not sure I have completely settled in my own head as to what what the answer is. So I was keen to get your view. But what you've said, I agree with. I certainly think that whether or not an organization or a team thinks that whether they have a service designer or not, ultimately organizations provide services to customers. That's why they exist. So services are being designed, right? Like whether or not they're being
Exactly.
designed consciously. I always remember, I think it was Roger Burlton when he was talking about processes, he was saying if your organization thinks it hasn't got a process for that, it has, it just sucks. And that's always
Yes.
stuck with me. And abstract that up a level and think, well, an end-to-end service. If no one's thought about an end-to-end service, it's not that it doesn't exist. It probably just sucks, right? And so it's
100%. So like, I think we get caught up on these like lines around things. Like you you're often doing UX without knowing you're doing UX. You're often doing service design without knowing your service design. And also people are doing business analysis without thinking they're doing business analysis. They're just doing management, they're just doing their job. And like, so part of all of our roles out in the world is to like help people not only like identify what they're doing, but also so that they can draw lines and parallels and they can learn and they can get access to more stuff. I think is like, once people kind of get their heads around what service design is, it's a really helpful framing, particularly when you're kind of dealing with, yeah, products and projects, like both benefit from the kind of concepts for sure.
Yeah, that actually leads me on to we'll get back to the submitted questions in just a moment, but one more from me first, which is again you mentioned projects there, and another thing I wanted to bring in here is so like if someone's used to a project environment, as I suspect many of us are, I expect we've all worked in project environments to some extent. What differences would they see in a product-centric model?
In a true product-centric model, like I like to think of it as like it's a different kind of flow. And in fact, that's often what when I'm trying to work out what the environment is, or what it's most like. I'm trying to work out whether work is pushed or work is pulled. Because underlying all of the kind of ceremonies and nonsense around like how people do product, ultimately that is what a true product team is that they have an objective and they are pulling work. They're defining what they're doing and then they're pulling the work into the team. They're not being instructed to do something or commissioned to deliver a feature. Whereas in a project, you're commissioning up front, you're pushing the work, you're saying, okay, cool, this is what we want. Go forth and do it. You might do that iteratively, you might do a whole bunch of stuff in there, but actually the work is being pushed. And so I think one of the things I see, particularly with business analysts, and actually anyone who's moving between the models, is our role in a project is often to stand with the business behind us and to tell a team or instruct or guide or however you want to frame it, but you're part of a push system. Whereas in product, you almost need to turn around the other way and go, okay, cool. I understand my product. I understand what the value is. I understand what it's delivering. I understand where it sits in the network of the system. And I'm standing towards the business and helping them understand so that then they can have a conversation about what we can do. So I don't know whether that analogy makes sense at all, but like it intuitively feels right. And I have definitely seen it. Like when BAs have made the transition, I'm like, cool. Stop trying to manage the dev team. Turn around, like go talk to them, like sell it, make them understand what you're representing and what it means. Does that make
That,
sense? I actually have
that
never said that out loud before.
it does to me, and I mean, when you were mentioning pulling again, it was making me think back to. I know I keep mentioning my opening unscripted question about outcome, but actually having to empathize and understand with whatever business and or customer you are dealing with, and that isn't necessarily the ultimate end customer, right? But
Yep.
whatever, and actually understand their problems, their needs, and how this product can meet those needs, or whether this product can meet those needs. So it kind of fits really nicely with what you, or if I'm understanding correctly, fits really nicely with what you were saying about that sort of strategic, messy, gnarly stuff, because it's about saying, well, hey, tell me your problems and let's work out a way of solving them,
Yeah.
rather than
Where
saying,
should it be solved? Yes. Yep. Yep. Yep.
yeah, rather than saying, do you want three or seven options in this drop-down menu? Which, I know I'm being deliberately facetious there, but you get the idea. Um, right, let's go to some questions that have been submitted. Um, so Christopher's asked another fantastic question, which I think if you can nail this one, Hannah, there's a book with this title probably. But if product is dying, what might be next?
That's a we should do a webinar explicitly on this. My reckons, if you want my reckons on the topic, is part of the reason I like called myself an outcomes engineer is with the rise of AI, I think we're going to see a return to the generalist. Except the generalist needs to be operating at a strategic level. It cannot be down in the weeds and the detail. So you heard it here first, outcomes engineer, or like something like that. There is, I think we'll see the collapse of roles again. Like we've gone out and now we're going to come back in again. UX is going to fold back in again. Service design is going to fold back in again. And I'm not saying, I don't think it's going to be called business analysis. I don't think we've got enough credit in the market for that to be the role title or the kind of concept. But I feel like there's going to be this generalist type thing across multiple domains, like sort of instead of T-shaped, what's a pie-shaped, maybe another leg,
Yeah,
stool shape. I don't know what
yeah.
you'd call it, but I think something more generalist.
It's really interesting because I see it similarly, but rather than an implosion, I see it as more like and I don't know what these things are called. I think in pictures, but you get these things where they've got coloured sand in a transparent thing, and you either
Yeah.
turn them over or shake them, and you can shake
Yep.
them, and are you going to tell me you've got one? Oh, I thought you were going to reach down and
No,
you have
no.
one. Then
I
it's
was just
like,
like my alarm was going off. I was just tuning up.
oh right, okay,
No, I know exactly what you mean. And yes, this kind of like being able to like go through shock and then just kind of be like, okay, cool, we've got this in this new environment. Like we can
but
bring this to the table. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
well, yeah, and but what I also think is like when you shake one of those, if you're of a mind, you can influence where the sand ends up, right? Because you can
Yep.
move it around, you can, and so what I think is that yeah, there's going to be this shaking of all the roles, but for those people who are actually prepared and thinking, and the kind of people who tune into webinars like this in their spare time, it's a great opportunity, right? Because
Yep.
you can start to actually shape that future. Um, I'm also keeping one half eye on the chat, and Stephanie's added something really interesting, which is strategic generalist is an appealing term. So
Yeah, I think that's where it's heading. I don't know whether I could put that on convince someone to put a contract with that around it, but I I think that's the gist, almost more so than outcomes engineer, the gist of what I think is going to come next, and it's going to be less about um these kind of like set things. I'm this versus I'm this. It's more of like, what skills are you bringing, and how can you help us move things forward?
yeah, yeah. Fantastic. So our next question comes from Raj, who asks, what are your thoughts on being technical as you flush through your product delivery?
God, I've weighed into the technical versus otherwise. I feel like you should go with that one. What do you reckon? Technical for doing product?
Oh, so I mean, I've got a view, but I'm not saying it's right. Okay. I'll put my cards on the table and then we'll see if they're the same or different. I'm I'm not technical. I don't consider myself to be technical. I know
Hmm.
enough to have a conversation with technical people. And I have deliberately sometimes steered away from having too much technical knowledge because I want to be able to have conversations with the business about the stuff the business needs. And I want to have enough technical knowledge to have a conversation with people who that's their expertise because I know that's not my expertise. Now, others draw the line in a different place. That's where I draw my line. But where do you draw yours?
Similarly, like I feel like if you're doing any product work, actually any project, if you're working with tech, you need to, I think I'm going to lean really, really heavily on like know enough. Like all of these things that we take part in, whether it be a business analyst or if we're in the product role, we're either making or facilitating decisions about the best steps. In order to do that, you need to understand enough. So you don't need to know like how to like set up a database or do anything, but you need to know enough to understand the context and the environment and the impacts of the decisions you're making. And so I think I broadly agree. I can see I have seen product peeps and BAs peeps who are um, too technical and lean too much on that and don't leverage it just to make the decisions or leverage it in the analysis. But I probably lean slightly further to you in like what's enough, particularly. But then, sorry, I'll caveat with a lot of my background is in bespoke software development, and in that environment, you genuinely do need to know more. Like it's different when you're configuring a product in a platform. It's quite different when you're everything is your bespoke code, right? You might have leveraged particular component trees and outsourced them. Um, that becomes you really need to understand what your logic is and how it works and your code stack and how that works and where things should live. And so, yes, I was like, went like, you should be more technical. And then I realized that I'm just talking about a specific context. So I walk it back.
Yeah, but then I think I agree with that, and that's the wonderful thing about phrases like technical enough,
Mm.
because what enough is varies by context, and also might depend on whether you've got someone who's doing some form of systems analysis or someone else to do that. If that role doesn't exist, then that might necessitate a different type of technical conversation. Um, but great. So let's move on to our next question from Adola. Apologies if I mispronounce anyone's names. It's always hard when you're not there for me to ask how to pronounce, but I think it's Adola. Where or how would you describe digital solutions or services in this context? Is that just another name for products?
It depends. Like I should have paid attention for when the question got asked because I'm not sure which context we're talking about in order to be able to answer the
So
question.
this is
Can
probably
you recall?
when we were discussing product is a product always in the context of a service?
I am. Um, yeah, I feel like the term product is pretty big and inclusive. Like it can just be like, and it almost doesn't matter what it is. It more matters like what does it mean here. um, but broadly speaking, yeah, I would say I think most solutions and services you could conceptualize them as products, you can conceptualize them as services, you could conceptualize them as solutions. The only one that wouldn't quite match is solutions implies like kind of a boundary of a platform or a product or like a code base. And if your products map directly to that, you might not be thinking in terms of value. You might just be thinking in terms of systems, um, which sometimes is value, but sometimes is not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Excellent. So I'm going to pivot from the submitted questions just for a moment because I want to come back to a question which I was planning to ask, which is around projects and products, which we were talking about a little while ago. And my question to you is, and I kind of suspect I know what your answer to this will be, but it's always good to know. It's like can and or should an organization run both project and product initiatives? is one better than the other? Or what determines which is best for a context? And I know there's a whole book in that question as well, but
There is. I'm keen to know what you think I'm going to say.
I think you would say so. I think you would say that it's contextual, but I think you would say that when there's high levels of ambiguity or complexity, that probably lends itself better to a product model when there's volatility. But I think you would probably also say that the organization has to be realistic about its own capacity to run capacity and will to actually properly run a product model. Because if it's a product in name only, then well, you can call it whatever you want. But that's just what I think you'd say.
Yeah, no, like great answer, Hannah. Like I love it. The only other thing I'd add to that is one of the benefits to a project is the temporary nature to it. Like people think of that as like I've already talked about total cost of ownership being like one of the downsides of not having full view. But sometimes in order to be able to make a significant change, like a pivot or like add a new service or do something really big, you actually need the temporary. You need the like, I'm going to scale up the people, the capability to support a genuine change, right? Like I feel like we've forgotten because everything became projects and then everything's now becoming product. We kind of forgot like the purpose of a project in the first instance, which wasn't like everything should be like that's how we do business. It was we're doing capex in order to be able to genuinely, we're doing investment in our model in order to be able to make a significant change. That's where projects shine. And so I think there is a case for lots of organizations that sometimes we're genuinely doing this temporary thing. We're investing, we're like head down, making this change, and we're expecting to do like an actual change as a result. So I think that's the scenario where like definitely do projects and you can do that alongside of products with the intent of like going into a product model. But I think those are the kind of two, like if you're wanting to kind of like run an ongoing, yeah, product. If you're wanting to make like a significant change, the temporary nature is actually beneficial. Like it's almost like going to stay in a hotel for a while your house gets redone. You kind of
Yeah.
need the temporary in order to be able to make the change.
Well, that's really interesting, and I don't know if this analogy will resonate, Hannah, but what as you were saying there, I was thinking, I remember a while back, actually this was quite a while back, when I was working on a rebrand project. And
Mhm.
rebranding, by the way, if anyone's ever asked to work on a rebranding project, I will tell you now, it is bigger than anyone thinks it is. Huge. Right. But that, and this involved conversations about like, you get into well, hang on a minute, the name on the bank so that it appears when someone gets a direct debit or whatever, like, it's, and oh, let's find every PDF with, so it's like really, but that's one off and it's done. Right.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of, is it one off, is it continual? Um, let's go back to some of the submitted questions. So I'm going to combine two questions now. So Olivia asks, how would you go about defining roles and responsibilities in a product team that has both a product owner and a business analyst? And I'm going to combine that with Michelle, who asks, do BAs working in product teams need different skills to BAs working within projects? So how would you define the roles and responsibilities in a product team that has a PO and a BA? And do those BAs need different skills?
Yes. I think there are different skills or different skills to make you more successful. Defining roles. So the PO/BA, I mean, I've got like a really, really spicy opinion that I almost feel like a
Oh,
PO
excellent.
is like a demotion from a business analyst, because business analysts should be working across multiple contexts, whereas a PO is defined context, right? Like you have quite set borders around that context. So that's why I giggle to myself every time someone says like, but Hannah, don't do outcomes engineer. You could become a product owner. I'm like, oh my God, like, why would I do that? So, but when you've got a PO and a BA, both working on a team, I've actually got this article brewing on this, but like there's lots of different combinations that you've got there, right? And it's not as simple to say this is the combination versus not. So the best way to think about it, I think, and this is what I would totally advocate for you, is what skills are you bringing to the table and what skills are they? Like you don't want to usurp the kind of product owner like accountability or decision-making power, but like, for example, when I'm like meeting a new product manager or owner for the first time, I'm like, okay, cool. This is what I'm good at. Like I do good facilitation. Like I'm good at like wrangling this stuff. Like, what do you need? And like, what of my skill set can support you to do your thing in order to better support this product? And that's as true for me being a contractor and just coming in and trying to wrangle it as it is for anyone on a team. Think of it less about like this is that role and this is my role, and more about like how can we support the product to be awesome, and that is you bringing your skills to the table and them bringing their skills and you helping them and the product shine. And in terms of like what that means for like a project versus product, I think there's a lot more facilitation that happens at that product. Like when you're on a product team, like a common thing would be you'd be running refinement sessions. Like you are facilitating with the team constantly. You're doing less of that whole like, okay, I'm going to run through my requirements and get kind of endorsement and approval. You're doing much more of like with the team building a shared understanding. And so those facilitation skills really come to the fore. And I feel like that's one of the things that I feel like project, even if you're working on a project environment, you can learn from what's happening over in product to genuinely smooth the flow from we're defining a thing through to we're delivering the thing. I don't even know, actually, I went on for too long. I don't know whether I answered the question. Please tell me.
I think so. And I think springboarding from that, one thing that seems to me at least to be very like that, just like, I think there are certain elements that it doesn't matter what the context is, you just need them. And the ability to empathize, be human, facilitate some form of agreement in a really complex, or at least a complicated situation where everyone's disagreeing, and also calling out when you've got that sort of like that air of agreement where there's like this thin veil of agree but you know that there's all this political nonsense beneath the surface, and someone has to say, are we just going to ignore the fact that none of you agree on this? So I think there's that common set of, and I don't know, I don't really like the term soft skills, but I can't think of a better one immediately. But those soft skills, that doesn't really matter if you're project or product, you need them in spades.
Agreed. Like if the core, what you're trying to do and the mechanisms by which you're doing them is basically the same thing. Like this is not, it's not, I think Stephanie said in the chat, essential skills.
Yeah, I just saw that. Brilliant. I mean, thumbs up, Stephanie. I think it's right. I'm going to move on to a question from Lauren, who says, have you any experience of redesigning governance and funding structures when moving from projects to products? And if so, any tips? And this is a question I think many people will have because, of course, often organizations will go, well, we're doing product now. Oh, but it's within the project wrapper because our governance has to still go through the gateways of a project.
Yeah. This is, oh my God, I'm going to like vomit a little bit in my mouth as I say this, but like this is actually where things like SAFE are helpful, because that's essentially what they do is they put a layer around a product delivery team and take care of that governance layer. So I've never taken someone through that transition at all. I've only like inherited various chaotic versions of it. But I feel like we don't collectively as a community talk about governance enough, because getting governance right and then enabling governance to do its job and to like unlock funding, input, all of the things, is we don't talk about it in project, and we certainly don't talk about it enough in product, particularly if you're not, because a true product team, the governance structure is, it gets funded, there is no governance, you're funding a team and it's perpetual and it's off, but like everyone away from that is like, you need some level of governance around the money or the funding. And particularly, like, I know I've seen chat in the chat, like people are working in the public sector now, you've got ratepayers and taxpayers, and it isn't just as simple as like, yeah, go for broke. So governance is super important. We don't actually unpack it enough. Advice for setting it up, honestly, like I just feel like people kind of avoid governance. Like they think that it's scary, they think that it's something that the project manager should do, or the product manager, and they kind of hands off it. My advice would be get stuck in and just build transparency into that process, because the more transparent conversations you have, the more genuine governance can actually occur, because that's what it is. Governance is the ability for someone to have some level of oversight to ensure that people aren't doing something crazy, and to ensure that it's alignment with things that are bigger and broader than necessarily a product team or a project team can be aware of. So like managing the politics, managing the sentiment, managing the buy-in, all of those things, those are all governance concerns. It's not just about money, though it always ends up being about money. But it isn't. It's much more, it's much bigger than that.
That's really interesting. And again, that comes back to like the bigger questions of outcomes and what outcomes are being sought, and whether the resources are being, the capabilities are being deployed in a way which will actually help with those outcomes. So, gosh, you've actually made governance sound really appealing, Hannah, and I never thought anyone would be able to do that. So, I mean, that's fantastic.
I wouldn't say appealing, but a necessary evil. And genuinely, if you want to influence things, like the higher up the stack you can influence, the more influential you are, right? And so governance is the ultimate place to influence.
Well, and I agree. And what I think is really interesting is governance, I think, gets a bad rep because the way it is seen, the way it is experienced, is a bunch of people either saying no or saying only if you fill in this impenetrable form, is how it's perceived. I'm not saying that's how it's intended, but that's how it's perceived. So actually, if you bring it back to its essence, you said something there which really resonated with me, which is creating enough transparency so that people can make sure that someone's not doing some crazy things, right? Actually, that's really sensible. Like that's a really valuable thing when you bring it back to actually it's making sure that we're doing stuff that furthers the vision of our organization in line with its strategy. I mean, that's a completely different way of thinking about governance. But anyway, I'm digressing.
No, there's a great comment in the chat about like governance happens whether you like it or not, and can be good or bad. And I like 100% agree with that. So like we are so often faced with like terrible governance setups, and you just got to deal, and your job isn't to change the governance, because that's ultimately what the business has decided to implement, but is to work with it and to help them be as good as they possibly can within the context, which could be okay or could be amazing depending on how you go.
Yeah, definitely. So thinking about practical tips, you've clearly got experience of project, product, all sorts of things in between. Can you share some practical tips you've picked up along the way? So if someone's like embarking in their first product-centric environment, what tips would you pass on?
First, work out whether it is product.
Yeah.
Like I feel like that's definitely where you should start, is that we and I know that we've hinted at it, like the kind of like the words and the framings of like, there are a lot of POs who are just project managers, right? Like that is what the role is. That's what they are being asked to do, and that is what they deliver. There's also lots of POs that are just delivery managers, also what they've been asked to do, and they also do a great job of it. Like I'm not saying that those people aren't doing an awesome job. I'm saying they're not doing product. So if you're facing any team, it's the classic, like you land in a thing, you're like, cool, so what's going on here? And I would suggest the key places to look is, how is the team functioning and how does the money flow? Once you understand those two things, you will understand where you are on the continuum, and whether or not you're actually just doing project but with sprints, or whether or not you're doing product but with some governance oversight, right? Like, where are you? And only until you kind of work out that can you go, okay, cool. So is it good? Because that's the next question, right? Like whatever the model is, it isn't necessarily inherently good straight from the bat. You have to go like, okay, cool. I understand how money's flowing. I understand how the team's working. Is that actually meeting the needs of the organization? Like, is it fast enough? Is it agile enough? Is it going way too fast and way too risky? And then you can start like kind of digging into how can I help that move in the right direction. That's what I kind of propose is like, do the analysis up front. Like, don't assume that because someone's got the title, they're doing product, because then probably not. Like 80% of the time, probably not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. You said something there about terminology or words and definitions, and making sure, like, so what words and terminology should we keep an ear out for? So any that might have different meanings depending on who we're speaking to. Like, are there certain words which you're kind of like, okay, okay, I'll give you an example. Whenever anyone says MVP to me, my first question is, when you say MVP, what MVP? What do you mean by that? Right.
Yeah.
So, like, are there any words or language that really make your ears perk up?
In this context, I would say like the word product owner. In fact, the word
Yeah.
product in of itself, or maybe even worse, product manager, because that is very dependent. Like, and partly this is where safe in like these kind of big agile scaled frameworks have not helped because they have instantiated these roles into this model and then given them very specific, like a product owner in a safe model is just absolutely worlds apart from like a true Silicon Valley Marty Kagan product owner concept or a product manager in that context. And so in one world, they're responsible for like customer retention and genuine revenue targets, right? In another
Yeah.
world, they're managing business cases and budgets and like doing traffic control. That's absolutely worlds apart, which is why like these these words that we use in this context with like project versus products, they're just meaningless and you're just going to need to unpick them and work out actually what they are. Like, I feel like business case is another one. I'm like, okay, cool. What do you mean by that? Like, because there is official definitions for what a business case is, but what that means in a context is wildly different. You know, like the only place where there is kind of a set understanding is usually in the public sector. Like in New Zealand, we have kind of set, this is what we expect depending on the funding, and this is how you get treasury, like blah, blah, blah. Like there's lots of stuff over there, but outside of that context, you can have everything from like a lean canvas to an opportunity canvas to like a 53-page document that's outlining your project plan before you get funding, right? Like, so
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
these words are meaningless. Like, almost everything we work with on the daily basis is kind of meaningless, and it's our job to work out like, what do you mean here?
Well, and this comes back to, without getting too philosophical, but actually, like, all of these terms are made up.
Yes.
I know that sounds really facetious, but it's not. Like, there is no natural thing with set boundaries called a business case. There are sets of practices out there that have
Yeah.
been written by people that have, with and useful stuff. But actually, I've always thought, and this is what I like, part of anyone's role as a change practitioner is to say, right, okay, so what do we need here? What would be sensible? It doesn't really matter what it's called, but what would be sensible?
Yep.
And to have a palette of options and a toolbox to mix metaphors, a toolbox and a palette, which would make you a painting, someone with a toolbox who paints. I don't know, but yeah,
I that
interesting.
that reminds me of a conversation I had once. I was running like a concept model session. It was at the start of like a really massive project, and so and we had a person in the room who was like, I know, like I like don't think this is necessary. Like we like these things are defined, and then we proceeded to spend like literally an hour and a half talking about an account. Like, what does an account mean in this context, right? Like, is an account the person, is the account the like it was in a kind of insurance model, so like is
Yeah,
the account the claim or is it that, and how would we put some boundaries around that, because we need to define this or our understanding of what this is. um and I remember the person being like just like completely blown away that we could spend so long on something that he genuinely thought was defined. And I was like, that this is often like, I mean, I know that not all projects are software, but in software, in the kind of work that we do in digital, nothing is defined. We can make up anything And so like the clarity around what things actually mean, and being comfortable with it being called whatever, but knowing what it means and knowing what it means in the context is just the only way to get stuff done. I
Yeah.
don't see how people can get stuff done if they don't have that context.
Yeah. 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 Fantastic. So we're almost out of time. If you are here live, by the way, please do stay till the very, very end. I've got a couple of links and things and bits of news to share. But one final question, Hannah, which is, well, actually two final questions, but one main final question, which is, what sort of final thought or biggest takeaway would you like to leave our listeners with?
It's not a binary, it's a continuum. So, and nothing's right on the continuum. There's lots of people who would tell you that this is the right way to do product, this is the right way to do projects. And they're almost always wrong. There's right for your context. There's only ever right for your context. And so don't blindly follow the thing or do the thing or think that there is a right, because there just isn't. And so like strike your own path on the continuum depending on where you are in the environment and what you're dealing with.
And fantastic, fantastic. Well, I am certain. So, I mean, I'm certain that people will want to stay in touch with you. They want to find out more about what you do. They want to read your blogs, and your updates on LinkedIn. I always really enjoy those sorts of things. How can people connect with you?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. Say hi. I have been a bit quiet because I've just been drowning at work, honestly. However, usually I'll be much more active, and hopefully next week, once I've cleared some hurdles, we'll be back to it. I also write a newsletter. I'm still working out what it is, but it's still fun. And you can sign up on my website if you're keen.
Fantastic. Well, I have just put a link to a link to your LinkedIn in the chat, so people can click right through. And please do, because the only thing about a virtual session like this is like there's no physical round of applause, right? And I always think a nice virtual round of applause, as well as the emojis which have been popping up, which is always great. But is actually go and connect with Hannah, because that's one way that Hannah will know, as I'm sure she already does, that this stuff has really, really resonated and landed with you. If we haven't been able to answer your question live, I am really sorry. We've had so many questions come through, but we've covered as many as we can. Just before we close the session, I've got a couple of community announcements to make. First of all, are the next two events. So I will paste these in the chat for you now. The next event is Product Discovery and Estimation on April the 16th. That's a 30-minute quick espresso sized event, and it's on LinkedIn Live. So you do need to have a LinkedIn account to do that, but it's completely free. You can click through and do that. And then in May, we have Introducing the Deliberately Adaptive Organization. That's a Zoom webinar like this one, so you can click through and register for that as well. Also, if you're not aware, there is a quarterly magazine, a BA Digest, which is completely free. And the next edition will be out in, well, actually in about a couple of weeks' time. We're actively working on it, and I'm just going to put the link to that in the chat as well. It's badigest.link. That's badigest.link. So if you've not seen that, go take a look at that and subscribe as well. All that's left for me to say is a massive thank you to Hannah
No,
for
thank you
taking
for
time.
having me.
Oh, it's
I'm
been
sorry,
so much fun.
I didn't realize the sun was going to come in on me.
Yeah, well, no, well, I feel like we could just carry on for hours. We need to engineer a situation to be in the same physical city and actually have a proper face-to-face conversation. That'll be amazing. But thank
And
you so
failing
much
that,
for
let's just do this again.
yeah, 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 definitely. Well, thank you for getting up so super early to do this. Enjoy the rest of your day, Hannah, and thank you again for everyone who attended live or watched the recording. So take care. See you again soon. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.